Hi, everybody. Thank you for attending our workshop today. We're going to be diving into Law 25 and talking a little bit about how we can help your organizations comply with this particular law using some of the technologies that we're bringing into the marketplace, and talking a little bit about some of those requirements and the nuances associated with it. So diving right into it, the basic concept of Law 25 is very similar to GDPR in the European market. And the concept is that we're transferring the ownership of PII or consumer-oriented kind of data or data about individuals back to the people themselves who facilitated provisioning that data to an organization in the first place. And that changes how we have to govern data, how we have to treat that kind of information. And then, of course, it also means that we have to be able to demonstrate that we're compliant with Law 25 and other privacy laws that are as well evolving in our market. C27 in particular at a federal level comes to mind. So with the passing of Law 25, there's a series of obligations that are being put in place by that law. September of 2023, last year, the majority of those obligations were enacted and they are now in place. So we have to be able to demonstrate that we are following the specific elements associated with that. The ones that really come to mind that I think are ones that we need to be concerned with in particular are ensuring that we have all the policies in place that are necessary and be able to demonstrate that we have those policies in place, putting together the overall privacy program, using things like technology and or elements of technology to ensure that we can demonstrate that we're compliant with those various different elements of the law. Having things like consents around how the data is going to be used. And what that really means is that we have permission from the person who's provisioned the data to our organization to use it with a specific manner or in a specific manner related to how we're going to be using that information to manage our relationship with that person. So those are all important elements of the legislation. But it's not necessarily a super easy thing to implement and comply with. There are different challenges that we see in the marketplace that are making it a little bit more of an uphill battle. Obviously, one of the biggest ones today that we're dealing with are data breaches. In the Canadian market in particular, it's growing on a weekly, unfortunately, a weekly basis in our particular market. And those kinds of challenges make it more challenging to comply, but also make it that much more important that we comply. And then, of course, the big ones are data is complex. It's distributed around our systems. It's distributed in third-party environments. It is of both structured and unstructured information. So when you think about all those digital assets that you have around the organization, those are all part and parcel of the kinds of data we need to be worried about. So when you think about how we have to implement a privacy program, there are key steps that we recommend our customers follow to be able to ensure that kind of compliance. And the first is, and an area that we're going to focus on for our conversation today, is something called automated data mapping. So we'll talk about that in a second. And you think about it almost like you're going to catalog all of the sensitive data you have in the organization, in particular data about people, so PII that you have in the organization, and you're going to want to track and manage it and govern it effectively to ensure compliance. And then step two, we'll allude to as we're talking about the mapping piece, because the mapping piece is the foundation for moving into the actual implementation of your overall privacy program and the key elements associated with that. So we'll talk about that to a certain level of detail. And then, of course, step three is where you're going to operate the program over the long term. This is not a one and done. The law is not going away. So we need to be able to ensure that we're governing our business and the data in our business over the long term to ensure compliance with the law. So let's dive right into automated data mapping and talk a little bit about what it is. So if you think about the concept of governing PII or personal information within the company, it's managing that overall data inventory of that PII. Now that includes all assets, all PII. So it's emails, it's attachments to emails, it's documents, could be spreadsheets, could be image files, could be scans of sensitive information that you have in different repositories, Word documents, etc. But it also includes your structured systems. It also includes data that you may have that you have on a third-party system. That a typical example might be your CRM, and you're using that data, but it's sitting on a third-party cloud somewhere. But at the end of the day, your organization is responsible for that information and ensuring that it's being governed according to the new legislation. Knowing who has access to the data, where the data flows, where it moves around the organization is all important. And then there's a key element of the law around. So one other element of the legislation we need to be concerned about is the concept of redundant data, or data that is no longer required within your organization to manage the purpose with which you collected it initially. So maybe it's old information about clients that you no longer have, or information that could be 10 plus years old that you just want to get rid of to reduce your overall risk footprint of information in the organization. And the law stipulates that this is a best practice that you should be doing. So how do you know what data is outdated, et cetera, within the organization? So that's all part of this. The other piece of it is this privacy impact assessment, or PIA. And what we're doing there is that we're feeding the privacy impact assessment process with the information we see in the data through the automated mapping program. And those PIAs are, again, a requirement of the law. And what that is basically whenever data is being used in the organization in a different way, or you're adding new systems to the organization, you do a privacy impact assessment to ensure that the project you're doing is going to be compliant with the legislation, and you want to record that. And obviously you're going to use the information that comes out of the privacy impact assessment, or sorry, from the automated data mapping process, to feed your impact assessment and ultimately catalog it and keep it and retain it over the long term. So automated mapping. Discovery, classification, tracking, and measuring your sensitive data on an ongoing basis throughout the organization. What that boils down to is typically a two-step process. Step one is you're going to want to baseline your current state. Understand the current state of data within the organization. Where is it? What is it? Classify it. Understand what those elements of data are. Understand your current state of compliance with Law 25, and understand your overall risk footprint across those data holdings. That's going to generate what in our business we love to call the good, bad, and ugly associated with your current data holdings across all data, structured, unstructured, etc. And it gets really interesting when we get into things like file shares and we get into email systems, because of course those are the areas where there's been the least amount of governance over the years. Organizations tend to have governed their structured data systems quite effectively, but their unstructured systems have generally been less governed. And then that baseline is sort of that step one, and that drives a remediation process. Remediation might be eliminating that redundant data. It might be cleaning up highly sensitive information that's in systems that you don't want it to be. It might be de-identifying data or anonymizing data that is in systems that you're required to maintain and use that information, but you want to ensure that when it's at rest, it is anonymized to lower the risk associated with holding onto those elements. All of those things are things that we discover in that baseline mapping process. Once that's done, the second process is going to be the continuation of that mapping, doing it on an ongoing basis so that you are tracking, tracing, and managing those sensitive elements all the time, and producing reporting around the risk and compliance of your data throughout the organization. So that's, in effect, the process of automated mapping. Discover, classify, report on it, govern it, reduce the risk associated with it, and ensure compliance. And then, of course, fix all the challenges that you see in the data. Now, classification is an interesting topic on its own. Out of the box, the technologies that exist in the marketplace today, including ours at Data Sentinel, will provide you with classification categories. Typically, they're public, internal, confidential, and restricted. But the key to success around classification is having a technology that can be customized so that it can learn your data and understand what is unique about your data assets. So the data that a bank holds and uses is going to be very different than the data that a retail organization holds and uses. Things like account numbers, et cetera, are going to be very unique to a particular business. So the classification technology must be able to be customized. It must be able to learn your data. So within Data Sentinel, we have the ability to be able to build these customized classification hierarchies. So a person, as an example, could be Mark Rowan, but that person could be an employee, it could be a customer or a high-valued customer. So you want to be able to classify the data differently depending on what that person is to your organization. So within the technology, you have the ability to build these hierarchies of classifications so that you can govern it differently depending on the element that you're talking about or the data elements you're talking about. The other thing that you want to be able to do within your classification technology is what we call clustering. And that gives us a risk evaluation. So in other words, Mark Rowan by himself, by itself as a set of data, isn't necessarily highly risky. But Mark Rowan coupled with credit card, social insurance number, address information, et cetera, is much, much more sensitive and therefore brings a higher risk depending on how that information is found within your systems. As an example, it could be in a document attached to an email. We did have a customer who had a data breach, and in that data breach, they had passport and driver's license scans of all their employees, and they were sitting in documents that were involved in the breach. So obviously that's extremely sensitive information. So knowing that in advance and ensuring that that kind of information is governed differently than obviously common information that would be of less risk is an incredibly important part of the art of classification and how we do it within core technologies like Data Sentinel. So that's a little bit on the whole classification process. Now, when you think about what am I getting out of this mapping exercise? Why do I do this? And what are the outputs that it's generating that are going to feed my governance, my privacy program, my security programs? That's a really good question. So when you think about what you're generating that complete sensitive data inventory, all the classifications, where the data sits. And that's important because you may have data on people who are part of the European Union or data that are specifically within the Quebec marketplace. And you're going to want to know that that data is exposed to different kinds of legislations. And you're, again, going to govern it differently based on its source. You're going to want to understand your risk. And then, of course, you're going to want to measure your compliance and know where the data moves, et cetera, and who has access to it, et cetera. All of those things feed your privacy program. And these are a bunch of acronyms, and forgive me, our industry is full of them, but DSAR is Data Subject Access Request. So that's the process whereby the consumer has the right to understand how you're using their data, how you're governing that data, or the right of deletion. If they no longer want to do business with you, they have the right to be able to request deletion of their information. Record of processing reporting is another element of the new legislation. And that really means having this common catalog that I just talked about, all those different things that are around cataloging, understanding how you're using and governing sensitive data, feed your record of processing reports. The privacy impact assessment, or the PIA, is another important part of it. And having the ability to be able to populate your privacy impact assessments or your PIAs with actual information about what's going on in the data is really critical. And then, of course, in security, you might have a data loss prevention technology. And you're going to want to use those common classifications across the organization and feed your security technologies. And then, of course, your data governance and the ability to be able to monetize the data. So one of the benefits associated with doing this kind of data mapping, not only are you ensuring that you're going to be compliant and that you're going to be governing and securing the data effectively, but you also are going to know where all of your critical data elements are, so that when you do things like modernization projects or cloud migration projects, you're going to be able to isolate just the data that's necessary to allow that data to be used and monetized downstream through other applications. So all of that are the kind of the outputs and the things that the automated mapping process is going to enable for your privacy, governance, security, and monetization programs. So at a super high level, that is automated mapping. Now, I mentioned DSAR. So I just want to talk a little bit about that because it's a really important element of the legislation. So just to remind you, data subject access request is the person you're doing business with, the consumer, or what we call in the industry, the data subject, has a right to understand how you're using and governing their data, or to request a deletion of those data elements if they no longer want to do business with you. There's a defined process to ensure that that person has the ability to exercise their rights. Typically, it starts off with a consumer or an individual clicking on the website, going to your privacy policy, initiating the DSAR process by clicking that link. And then internally in your organization, there's a technology that we bring to the market that catalogs that request being made. It starts a workflow, and that workflow is something that someone in your organization will process. And it may, let's say it's a deletion request, then it's going to go out into the technology that's implemented by Data Sentinel in your organization, and it's going to collect all the information about that data subject, and it's going to drive that deletion process. It can be automated, it can be semi-automated, or it can be manual. So depending on the systems and how you want to govern and manage this process. At a very high level, that's DSAR. And then, of course, you have to report back to the data subject that you completed the process. And there is a timeline that's being enforced by the legislation on how long that takes. It's an extremely important part of the law because it's one of the ways that you actually demonstrate that you're being compliant to the consumers that you may do business with within your organization. It's very visible to them, so it's something that you're going to want to ensure that you do. And again, very quickly, and maybe in just a 1-minute snippet, we talked a little bit about privacy impact assessments. There are a number of different kinds of assessments that are required by privacy legislation, including Law 25. The PIA is one. There is the idea of a transfer impact assessment. So basically, you're moving data to a third party, and you want to be able to ensure that you're doing so within the limitations of the law. And then AIA is something new that's coming into the market, probably 2025. And that's really where we begin to govern automated decision-making technologies, or AI for the more general term that people use. So that law is being written at a federal level. It's called ADA, and we do anticipate that that's something that's going to come into the Canadian market in probably 2025. So a future. The idea of these assessments is that you're going to be evaluating projects that are moving data around the organization. And you want to ensure that you're doing so in a compliant manner. So there's a process that's built into the technology to evaluate whether you need to do a PIA or not. And then what assessment will you do? And in this case, we're suggesting it's going to be a PIA. And then you're going to be executing that PIA and then cataloging that you did it, that you greenlit a project or stalled a project or stopped a project from happening based on that project's risk and its compliance with the privacy legislation. So that whole process is something that we are semi-automating in the core technology that we're talking about today. Speaking of the core technology, just to give you a quick understanding of how the technology gets deployed and how it gets implemented. An important part of Data Sentinel is that the technology is implemented behind your firewall. No data moves. Your data stays in the systems that you are governing and behind your security protocols, etc. So that's really, really important. You don't want your data moving off to a third-party cloud. You don't want your privacy technology and or your governance technology to be moving data outside of your environment. That kind of defeats the purpose. So it's all behind your firewall. The technology connects up to all your different systems, structured, unstructured, semi-structured, and it looks at all the data that's out there, catalogs it, classifies it, measures the risk associated with it, profiles it, gives you an understanding of the accuracy of the data, completion of the data, or completeness, forgive me, of the data, etc. And then, of course, measures what it sees against the rules or policies and or laws that you want to govern your data around. And then that drives all the reporting and the outcomes that are necessary to govern the data in the light of the privacy law, and then obviously use those assets for various different purposes downstream. So that core technology is what gets deployed within a client environment to do everything that we just talked about and to help you automate the processes relative to governing and managing your data in light of Law 25. When we work with clients, that typically comes with assets that we deliver to our customers that are part of our privacy framework and governance framework. And that includes things like policies, templated procedures, roles, responsibilities, all the things that are necessary to actually have a complete privacy program and or governance program, or a combination of those two, deployed within your organization, supported by the core technology that we just talked about. So at a very, very high level, just to summarize, those are the kinds of things that we recommend customers do when they go to implement their privacy program. Initiating it with a data mapping exercise that is going to tell you the good, bad, and ugly of your current state of compliance. It's going to drive a remediation process. And then in the follow-on steps, you're going to be implementing your overall privacy program, your privacy impact assessment framework, your ROPA framework, the data subject access request technologies, and so on. All the things we just talked about will become part of your overall privacy program. And then, of course, you're going to be managing it over the long term. So hopefully you found that to be of interest. We're more than available to answer any questions or to dive into this in a little bit more detail around your specific circumstances. So thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it. Have a great day.